When we hear the word Viking, the image that usually comes to mind is that of bearded warriors sailing across the icy northern seas in their longships. Swords in hand, horned helmets, even though those helmets never actually existed, and war cries echoing across distant lands. But what if I told you that, beyond all the conquests and battles, the Vikings were also farmers? Yes, while some set off in search of new lands, others stayed behind to face a challenge just as tough as war, surviving a harsh environment by growing whatever they could in rocky soil and a climate that seemed determined to kill every crop. For centuries, these Nordic communities managed to grow enough food to feed entire villages, despite poor soil, short growing seasons, and no modern technology. No tractors, no greenhouses, no drip irrigation, and no chemical fertilizers. All they had was raw strength, knowledge passed down through generations, and a quiet ingenuity that rarely gets mentioned in history books. In this video, we're going to explore this lesser-known side of the Vikings, the farmer. The one with dirt-stained hands and eyes trained on the changing seasons, coaxing life out of cold and stone. But before we understand how they farmed, we need to understand where they farmed. And the landscape that unfolds is anything but inviting. When we think of farming, we usually picture wide open fields, rich soil, steady rainfall, and a reasonably predictable climate. But for the Vikings, the reality couldn't have been more different. Medieval Scandinavia was, in many ways, a land of extremes. Winters were long, dark, and brutally cold. Summers were short and rushed, sometimes lasting just a few weeks in certain regions. And the soil, well, most of it was rocky, acidic, or simply too shallow for roots to grow easily. In Norway, for example, most of the land is mountainous, which drastically limited the space available for farming. Iceland, settled by Vikings in the late 9th century, posed even greater challenges. Covered in volcanic lava, prone to eruptions, swept by harsh winds, and marked by sandy, nutrient-poor soil. Denmark and southern Sweden had a slightly milder environment, but even there, nothing compared to the rich, black soils of southern Europe. There was also the issue of sunlight. In winter, daylight was almost non-existent, and even in summer, the window for planting, growing, and harvesting was so short that any mistake could mean hunger by the next winter. The farming calendar had to be followed with absolute precision. A delay of even 1 or 2 weeks in planting could jeopardize the entire year's harvest. And as if that wasn't enough, unpredictable rain, late frosts, or natural pests could wipe out months of hard work in just a few days. Looking at all this, it's easy to assume farming would be impossible. But it was exactly in this harsh environment that the Vikings showed their true adaptability. Instead of giving up, they studied nature, learned from the land, and slowly developed simple, yet incredibly effective techniques to make agriculture work in even the most hostile conditions. And this is where the story gets even more fascinating, because the Vikings' true brilliance wasn't just in where they farmed, but in how they managed to do it with so few resources. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next chapter. If farming the Scandinavian land was already a challenge on its own, doing it without any kind of modern machinery made the task even more impressive. No tractors, no iron plows, no mechanized systems for irrigation or harvesting. What the Vikings had were simple tools, physical strength, and a deep understanding of the seasons and the soil. The most important tool was the wooden plow, often reinforced with iron at the tip. This plow, known as the ard, was pulled by oxen and used to carve shallow lines into the earth. In rockier or steeper areas, where even the ard couldn't be used, all the work had to be done by hand, with hoes, spades, and rakes. These rudimentary tools required immense effort, which is why making use of every fertile inch was crucial. The most valuable lands were found near the fjords, where the soil was deeper and the moisture helped crops grow. There, the Vikings created small fields called tun, usually enclosed with wooden fences to keep animals from invading and destroying the crops. Another essential technique was letting the land rest. Even without modern scientific knowledge, they understood that the soil needed time to recover. So they practiced an early form of crop rotation, changing what was planted in each area every farming cycle. One season might be barley, the next oats, and then the field would be left fallow, with grazing animals helping to fertilize the soil through their waste. In fact, using animal manure as fertilizer was both common and crucial. In an environment with poor soil, every natural resource had to be used to its fullest. Waste from stables, and even wood ash from the hearth, was mixed into the earth to improve its fertility. In many villages, farming was combined with raising animals like sheep, goats, and cows. This not only provided meat and milk, but also power for plowing, wool for clothing, and manure to enrich the soil. It was an integrated system where each element supported the others, like a rough but well-tuned machine. This combination of manual techniques, close observation, and efficient use of available resources is what made Viking agriculture possible. They didn't try to conquer nature by force, but rather learn to understand it and work with it. A mindset that many modern farmers are beginning to rediscover today. But the biggest challenge was still ahead: how to deal with areas where the land was truly barren, dry, or infertile. In other words, how do you grow crops where almost nothing should grow? If farming the more fertile areas already required serious effort, imagine the regions where the soil was dry, rocky, or just plain barren. But for the Vikings, abandoning those lands was never the first option. Instead, they developed clever strategies to adapt the terrain for agriculture, often turning seemingly useless land into productive fields. One of their smartest and surprisingly simple solutions was the use of wood ash. After heating their homes with firewood through the winter, the Vikings collected the ashes and spread them over the soil. Even without understanding the chemistry, they noticed that this residue made the earth feel more alive. Today, we know that wood ash raises soil pH and adds potassium, which is especially helpful in the acidic soils typical of Scandinavia. Another crucial technique was the use of animal manure, mixed with straw and organic waste from their homes. The manure was composted in a rudimentary way and used to enrich the soil. This early form of composting helped maintain nutrients in the ground, especially after long winters that drained the land of its vitality. But fertility wasn't the only issue. Water, for instance, could be scarce during certain times of year, despite the abundance of rain and snow in others. To deal with this, the Vikings built drainage and retention channels, shallow ditches that collected meltwater and rain, guiding it to their fields. In sloped areas, they carved small steps or plateaus into the land, creating a basic terracing system that reduced erosion and helped keep moisture in the soil longer. And what about areas where the soil was too shallow or filled with rocks? They simply removed the stones by hand and used them to build walls and fences, known as steinvegar, many of which can still be seen today in parts of Iceland and Scotland. This slow, repetitive work was often done during the colder months, when planting wasn't possible but the land could still be prepared. In addition, the Vikings made use of marginal areas like marshes and wetlands, which they slowly drained over generations. Over time, these became usable fields for growing hardier crops like oats. It's important to note that these solutions weren't applied in isolation. Each village adapted its techniques based on local terrain, climate, and community resources. It was a custom-built form of agriculture, shaped by trial, error, and constant observation of nature. This mastery over harsh land not only ensured food for the winter months, but also made it possible to store surplus and even trade with other communities. With a reliable agricultural base, Vikings could support entire families, prepare provisions for long journeys, and sell or exchange their excess crops. Viking farming was, above all, a collective effort, and it's this spirit of collaboration among community members that leads us into the next chapter of our journey. None of the solutions we've seen so far would have worked if the Vikings had acted alone. Farming, in such a harsh and challenging land, wasn't an individual task. It was a communal effort. From preparing the soil to harvesting the crops, everything was done together. Neighboring families helped one another, organizing work in shifts, sharing tools and draft animals, and rotating tasks in each other's fields. This was especially important during the critical parts of the year, planting in the spring and harvesting at the end of summer. Missing those windows could mean having nothing to eat during winter. This collaborative mindset went beyond practice. It was rooted in Viking social organization itself. Decisions about land use, property boundaries, and even the sharing of natural resources like water and pastures were made in local assemblies called things. In these gatherings, free men of the community came together to make collective decisions, a form of self-governance that, in some ways, foreshadowed democratic principles. There was also a strong culture of reciprocity. If a family suffered a setback, like a storm destroying their crops, others stepped in to help with grain, labor, or even shelter. This wasn't just about kindness, it was about survival. Everyone knew that next year, the roles could be reversed. In the most isolated regions, like parts of Iceland or Greenland, this cooperative spirit was even stronger. In those communities, nearly everything was shared: seeds, livestock, labor, and even new techniques learned by someone with more experience. The harvest, in turn, was almost like a festive event. Everyone joined in: women, men, children, and when the work was done, there were usually celebrations with food, drink, and music. It was a time to give thanks, not just to the land, but to each other. This quiet, resilient collective strength was one of the greatest advantages of Viking farmers. And thanks to this joint effort, they not only managed to plant, but also to diversify their crops. And that's exactly what we'll explore in the next chapter: what the Vikings grew and why their choices were so strategic. With so much effort going into making the land farmable, the choice of what to plant was never left to chance. Every seed sown had to prove its worth. It needed to withstand the cold, grow quickly, and most importantly, be useful for food, for storage, and even for trade. In this, the Vikings showed themselves to be not just practical, but deeply strategic. Their main crops were hardy grains, especially barley, oats, and rye. These cereals had three key advantages. They tolerated cold climates, matured quickly, and could be stored for long periods. Barley, for example, was used to make porridge, coarse bread, and even beer, a staple drink in Nordic communities. Oats were versatile, nutritious, and excellent for feeding both people and animals. Rye, on the other hand, grew well in poor soils, making it ideal for more difficult terrain. Alongside grains, they also planted legumes such as peas and beans. These plants helped replenish nitrogen in the soil, acting as a natural fertilizer. They were also rich in protein, an essential part of the diet during the long, food-scarce winters. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and wild onions were another key part of Viking agriculture. They grew well in colder climates and could be stored in insulated ground pits or cellars, lasting through winter. Turnips were especially common, so much so that they were often considered the poor man's vegetable. In the milder southern regions of Scandinavia, crops like kale, leeks, and cabbage were also grown. These were used in broths and stews and were typically planted near homes in small gardens, often tended by the women of the household. But not everything they grew was food. The Vikings also cultivated flax to produce textile fibers and medicinal herbs like angelica and chamomile, used for both healing and flavoring. The choice of crops was deeply connected to the rhythm of nature. The Vikings knew they had only one shot at planting each year. Everything had to be ready before the first frost. This gave rise to an unwritten agricultural calendar, passed down orally and followed with near-religious devotion. What people planted also revealed what they valued. For instance, a large stock of barley could mean a plentiful feast in late autumn. A diverse garden, on the other hand, suggested a family with knowledge and good organization. There was even a certain prestige in being a skilled grower. After all, mastering the land was a sign of strength and independence. In this sense, farming wasn't just about survival. It was culture, it was tradition, it was identity, and even with the right seeds, collective effort, and effective techniques, nothing ever truly guaranteed a successful harvest. Sometimes, nature imposed its own rules, harsh and unforgiving. When the harvests were good, The Vikings didn't just secure food for the entire year. They also produced surpluses. This extra wealth could be used to strengthen their communities, ensure security, and expand their horizons beyond the Nordic lands. These agricultural surpluses, mainly cereals like barley and oats, along with products like wool and animal hides, became valuable items in Viking trade. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, the Vikings became renowned traders and explorers, navigating seas and rivers to exchange their goods for metals, spices, fine textiles, and other items they couldn't produce themselves. In farming villages, the storage of surplus was carefully planned. The Vikings used elevated granaries, often built on stilts, to protect the grain from moisture and rodents. This ensured the goods would last until the next agricultural cycle, or be shipped off on trading expeditions. Beyond personal use, this agricultural trade helped strengthen alliances with neighboring peoples and even funded raids and colonization efforts. Vikings often traded surplus with communities across continental Europe, the Baltic region, and even the East, making their farms a fundamental pillar of their expanding economy. It's important to remember that agriculture and trade weren't isolated activities. They complemented each other, forming a complex network where local production fueled Viking growth, both cultural and territorial. The ability to turn difficult soil into food, and from that generate wealth, is a testament to Viking ingenuity. It's a crucial part of understanding how this culture, so often associated only with war and raiding, was also deeply rooted in farming, hard work, and cooperation. But for all of this to happen, one final ingredient was essential: resilience and constant adaptation in the face of climate shifts, conflict, and technological limitations. The story of Viking agriculture is also a story of resilience in the face of constant challenges. Whether it was the harsh Scandinavian climate, natural environmental changes, or internal and external conflicts, the Vikings had to become masters of adaptation. Throughout the centuries they farmed these difficult lands, the Vikings faced periods of climate shifts, cycles of intense cold, short summers, and long winters. These variations, now known as part of the Little Ice Age, required flexibility in crop choices, soil management, and even the agricultural calendar. When temperatures dropped lower than usual, harvests diminished and food stocks had to be used more carefully. That's why crop diversity and animal husbandry created a safety net, where the failure of one harvest could be offset by another source of food. Beyond climate, pressure from other peoples, and even internal migrations forced Viking communities to reorganize. Some farms were abandoned, others merged, and new techniques were adopted, often inspired by neighboring cultures the Vikings encountered on their expeditions. This ability to absorb outside influences was crucial. For example, after contact with continental European peoples, more efficient farming methods, like improved use of the iron plow, began to be adopted, enhancing soil preparation. But perhaps the Vikings' greatest asset was their collective mindset in the face of hardship. Cooperation, resource sharing, and the accumulated wisdom passed down through generations ensured that, even in difficult times, agriculture remained the foundation of survival. This resilience wasn't just physical, but also cultural. It was a way of life, a perspective on the world, and a relationship with the land that made farming more than mere subsistence. It was an expression of Viking identity. And so, over the centuries, these techniques and values shaped a legacy that can still be studied and admired today, a testament to the human ability to cultivate hope and life even in the harshest conditions. With this spirit of adaptation and courage, the Vikings left their lands to explore the world, but never forgot that the strength sustaining them came from the soil beneath their feet. And to close this journey, let's recap everything we've learned and reflect on what this story can teach us today. Throughout this journey, we've seen how the Vikings, far from being just warriors and navigators, were also ingenious farmers who turned natural challenges into opportunities. Cultivating large fields in arid lands, without tractors or advanced technology, demanded not only practical knowledge, but a deep connection with the land, community, and tradition. With simple yet effective techniques, from using ashes and manure to creating irrigation channels and terraces, they built sustainable agricultural systems that allowed them to survive and thrive in harsh environments. This agriculture, based on cooperation and careful observation of nature, is a powerful example of human adaptation. Moreover, the careful selection of crops, combined with rituals and beliefs that strengthen their spiritual bond with the earth, helped maintain a balance between people and the environment. The surplus they produced wasn't just food for families, but fuel for trade and connections with other cultures, extending the Vikings' influence far beyond their native lands. Their legacy is not limited to tales of raids, but also includes agricultural wisdom that can inspire us today. In times when sustainability and environmental respect are more urgent than ever, looking back and learning from ancestral practices can open pathways toward a more balanced future. The story of Viking farmers invites us to rethink what it means to cultivate, survive, and prosper, showing that even in adversity, collaboration, creativity, and respect for the land are always key to success. Thank you for joining this journey through time and knowledge. May the strength and resilience of the Vikings inspire you to face your own challenges with courage and